in light of that great introduction, I think it'd be nice to start with a question about the international situation, especially given we are in the International School of Geneva, which was one of the first international schools, and our very close ties to the UN. So in the context of President Trump's isolationist policies, and even the UK Labour government cutting aid spending in order to hike that on defence, how do you feel about this increasing shift away from multilateralism, away from international ties, international trade, aid and development?
I've been this morning down to the UN Human Rights Council to talk to people there, and I've been attending UN Human Rights Council meetings over many years to bring up different issues and causes. And the Universal Declaration of 1948 was a very important demonstration of global unity on human rights, and that human rights law is used by many people around the world to try and defend themselves against oppression and attacks. What I find so depressing about the Trump approach is that none of it is ever referenced into the history of how any of these things came about. Donald Trump seems to have skipped a few history classes when he was at school, probably more than a few. And it is a retreat away from any kind of global agreement and order. Some of it is surprising, some of it is strange, and some of it is done for effect. And I mean, the endless changes in the tariff rates between different countries. I mean, we could try a quiz about who can remember what the tariff is at this moment against, for example, Mexico or Bolivia or something, and you know, we'd never know because it might have changed again this morning for all we know. But it is a retreat away. Now, when the League of Nations was founded, Woodrow Wilson, who was the inspiration behind it, but not the only one, but he was one of the main inspirations behind it, couldn't then get it past the US Senate. And so the US was never a member of the League of Nations, and they went into the isolationism of that period. Trump sees himself in that mould, but I also think he sees himself in a slightly different mould, in that it will be a more isolationist USA, yes, but he also is spending even more money on arms and defence than any previous administration has spent. Global arms expenditure was $2.4 trillion in 2023, set to rise a great deal. In the case of Britain, going up by 13 billion a year from 27 onwards. So he sees the world as bigger armies, more arms, therefore the danger of more wars. But he also sees one where the US will assert its economic power by the use of tariffs. My feeling is it will actually probably have the opposite effect. It will mean that those countries at the moment, like Mexico and Canada, for example, who trade very heavily with the United States. Mexico is 80% of its trade. Canada, I think 60 or 70% of its trade is with the USA. They will not feel confident that that trade will be able to carry on because there's constant change in tariffs and so on. And they will start to trade elsewhere. And the BRICS group of nations, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, China, will become stronger. They have other members as well, become a stronger force, and also become a stronger economic force, and set up its own banking system, which it's doing, and potentially its own world tradable currency. So we're into a period of growing competition between an economic bloc led by China, India, etc., and a US isolationism but still has the dollar, and Europe that is frankly undecided about what it wants to do. There are some in Europe, such as Keir Starmer, who think that Europe should take over the role of the USA and become a sort of self-appointed interfering policeman around the world, and those that see Europe as a social Europe of one of cooperation and peace. I hope we get the latter. So I think we're in for a very interesting period, but it's also an incredibly dangerous period. The war in Ukraine has taken possibly 1 million lives altogether. If it doesn't stop, it'll take many more. A ceasefire, which is supposed to be starting today, would at least lead to negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and hopefully some kind of agreement on a form of coexistence for the future. That can only be the way forward. The war in Gaza, which has already taken 60,000 lives, and many thousands more on the West Bank and elsewhere in the region as the war spreads into Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. Incredibly dangerous situation. The constant supply of weapons by the USA to Israel to continue that means that the war has got worse and the killing rate has got worse, and we're now into probably 70 days or more of no supply of any materials whatsoever into Gaza. As we speak, children are starving to death. Their emaciated bodies, with their eyes popping out their head because everything else is diminishing, are dying. And if they can see past the fence into Israel, where there's food, where there's water, where there's medicine, where there's comfortable living, being deliberately starved to death, it's abominable. And that's why I spend so much time working very hard to try and bring about peace. And if I may say so, working with people, small number maybe, people in Israel who also appalled at what's going on and also want the occupation to end and also want that war to end. We need to have a global voice to bring an end to that war.
Next question? Yep.
Thank you. You mentioned Keir Starmer's global policeman approach. If you were in Keir Starmer's position today, what would you do to address the rise of populist Trump-style politics, as well as the increasing support for far-right parties such as Reform UK, particularly among the working class and young men?
The rise of the far right across Europe, it's not just in Britain with Reform, it's in France with Front National, it's in Germany, AfD, and so on. And they are in or near government in several countries. And the basis of their support is very much the same basis of support that Donald Trump manages to get in certain parts of the USA, where essentially you go to communities that are poor, that are losing out in lots of ways on jobs, on housing, on education, on living standards, and blame it all on refugees, blame it all on somebody else, and you build up a huge sort of hate fest, and that way you gain support. Quite honestly, the Nazis used exactly the same tactics in Germany at the height of the Weimar Republic, when inflation was rampant in Germany. That led to mass unemployment, led to mass poverty, and Hitler blamed it all on the less than 500,000 Jews that were in Germany at that time. That ended up with the Holocaust, and the millions of Jews from all over Europe were murdered by the Nazis as a result of where that policy started from. What would I do? First of all, the whole purpose behind what I put into the manifestos and what we fought 2 general elections on was, one, improvement of working class living standards by raising the minimum wage by a significant amount immediately. Secondly, by reducing taxation for the poorest people, so you raise the tax threshold where you don't pay any tax at all. Thirdly, by a program of significant levels of investment in health, housing and education. And fourthly, increasing corporate and personal taxation at the top end of the scale. So you begin to quite rapidly see a reducing of poverty levels, accompanied by housing programs and health programs that go with it. So people would begin to see an improvement of living standards. What we have is the Social Democrats in Europe generally are seeing the Conservative parties moving to the right in order to try and not lose support to the far right. So the British Conservatives move to the right to try and not lose support to Reform, which hasn't worked terribly well for them. Social Democrats in Germany moved to the right because the Conservative parties moved to the right. So you end up with socialist and social democratic parties preaching exactly the same language as the Conservatives of others, which is about balanced budgets, which is about spending more money on arms and weapons, and therefore reducing working class living standards. So Starmer's government has refused to end the two-child benefit cap, which means that it's only the first two children in a large family that get any benefits, the rest don't. And there's a monthly limit on what benefits any household can get, which leads to terrible poverty, and not to control rents, which are rising very, very fast, indeed the fastest in Europe. And so from a year ago, when Labour won an election, albeit on a very low vote, it won it on only 33% of the vote, the support has gone down by between 15 and 20 points in less than a year, and is doing very, very badly. And some of that support, not all of it, some of that support is going to the Reform Party and the far right. So my whole purpose would be to challenge the far right and challenge them on their racism and their attacks on refugees and migrants, and point out an uncomfortable truth to some of them, that migration is a plus all across Europe. Without migration into Europe, there wouldn't be much of a health service in any country, there wouldn't be much of a transport system, there wouldn't be much of an education system across the whole of Europe. And so you can achieve if you support and mobilise people. And I know political campaigning is never easy, particularly if you're telling people a message they haven't possibly heard before. But I was very proud to get re-elected last July. On the last leaflet we put out, I put on the front page of it, refugees are welcome here. And I still got elected. It can be done if you're prepared to go out and do that campaigning. You don't have to concede ground to the right in politics if you want to bring about social change. And if we don't get active and bring that about, then goodness knows what the future in Europe's going to be. Do we want to descend into the sort of cultural nihilism of the far right all across Europe and the anti-immigrant message that goes all across Europe, or do we want to build a continent that's one of social solidarity, of people working together and dealing with the real issues, which are poverty, inequality, injustice and environmental destruction?
So you did say in your introductory speech that you have had some controversial opinions in the past, and you still do, obviously, and you come under a lot of fire for those.
Controversial about justice.
No, well, I'm not referring, but just to challenge you on some of those matters. So, for example, Ukraine, you have been criticised for your position on Ukraine, which has largely been in terms of opposing intervention. Am I right in saying opposing military support and intervention for Ukraine? So what do you say to critics who would, call this kowtowing to an authoritarian regime, kind of allowing a violation of international rules-based order and giving it the kind of Munich conference-like leeway to push further on its expansionist policies? And then in tandem with that, another area that's kind of linked that you've received criticism for, again, is military spending and disarmament. So in the past, you've called for huge reductions to military spending and nuclear disarmament as well. So do you hold by those calls in this climate of international insecurity?
Yeah, thanks. Let's take them in reverse order. We have in this world the ability to destroy it about 500 times over with the nuclear weapons at disposal of China, Russia, France, Britain, the United States, Israel, North Korea, India and Pakistan. I was asked if I would use nuclear weapons, and I said no. I would never use a nuclear weapon, because they said, well, why not? I said, because I don't want to be the one who brings about the death of hundreds of thousands of people because of one decision that I made. There is no defense in a nuclear war. If a nuclear war starts anywhere in the world, that's it. That's it. A nuclear winter follows, famine follows, climate change follows, and everything else follows. There is no way out of a nuclear war. There's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. And so I have supported nuclear disarmament all my life. I've attended many of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences, which is attempting to stop the spread of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons, which have actually been successful in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia are nuclear weapons-free zones. And I'm hoping to go to Hiroshima for the 80th anniversary of the nuclear explosion that happened there in 1945. That'll be in August. And so I don't think nuclear weapons provide any defense. And you ask yourself, would any rational person actually use nuclear weapons? And if you think they're a defense, does the person who is so irrational to use a nuclear weapon, if they had the opportunity, actually going to care one way or the other whether you've got one, because that'll be the end of it. Now, India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. They have nuclear weapons because of the colonial hangover of the lack of decision over Kashmir. If India launched a nuclear attack on Pakistan, or Pakistan launched a nuclear attack on India, the people of Lahore and Delhi wouldn't know from which bomb they'd died, because they're so close together. It's absurd. You cannot bring about peace through it. So I am passionately against nuclear weapons and will remain so. The question of arms expenditure has increased arms expenditure, and it's now, as I said, 2.4 trillion a year and rising. Is it bringing about a more secure world, or would real efforts for peace and justice bring about a more secure world? Of the wars that are going on at the present time, I've said plenty about Palestine, and I do strongly hold to the view that Israel must be forced to stop the bombardment of Gaza by ceasing the supply of weapons and material to it, and that Israel withdraws from Gaza and the West Bank, so at least we can bring about some kind of peace for the Palestinian people, that the society can be rebuilt. In the case of Russia-Ukraine, one, I do not support what Russia has done, and never do support what Russia has done. And indeed, those people in the British media that accuse me of being a loyalist of Putin, really, it's a bit weird. I've actually never met Putin. I don't know him in the slightest. The time he came to Britain on a state visit at the invitation of Tony Blair, Tony Blair entertained him at the opera on one of the evenings that he was visiting Britain. Tony Benn, who's passed away now sadly, a left Labour politician, and myself, were outside protesting the visit in support of the people of Chechnya and of human rights in Russia. And so I'm quite confident and comfortable with my own record of always standing up for human rights wherever, even if it's seen as unusual or uncomfortable, and that includes human rights of people in Russia, just as it would in the USA or indeed anywhere else in the world. Ukraine was wrong to be invaded. I do not think the solution to it is pouring more and more weapons in. I think the solution to it is to try and force and bring about a ceasefire. And that may be happening now. That ceasefire should have been called for and operated for by the UN, or at the very least the European Union nations should have been involved in it. They didn't either make the effort or get very far with it. The only people that made credible efforts to bring about a ceasefire were the late Pope Francis and the African Union and a number of Latin American leaders, particularly President Lula of Brazil. I think there is an opportunity now to get an unconditional ceasefire, which obviously is a ceasefire, it's not peace. A ceasefire means both sides agree to stop fighting. And after that, some kind of negotiations, which I would guess would probably take you somewhere towards what was in operation before, which was the Minsk Agreement on a form of semi-autonomy for the Donbass, without ceding it totally away from Ukraine. Now, I know things have moved on a long way, and both countries have lost huge numbers of soldiers, but a ceasefire would stop what is almost a First World War equivalent of the loss of life in Ukraine. Ukrainian refugees should then have the opportunity, if they wish to go back to their country, if not to stay. And indeed, there's quite a lot of Ukrainian refugees in my own community who I've absolutely welcomed to my community and met them and talked with them. And so my search is for peace. My search is for justice and human rights. Should there not have been a lot more engagement to try and stop the war happening? Because it was pretty obvious that stuff was building up, both with NATO and with Russia, that was going to lead to a dangerous confrontation at some point. Surely we should be moving to a Europe of less military entanglement, less military tension, and more focus on social justice, both for the people of Europe and the people of the rest of the world, by fairer trading arrangements with those countries.
For the final question, I want to go back to your comment about the importance of ending the conflict in Gaza. Given that the regional conflicts in the Middle East seem to be escalating, what might a realistic solution, one that breaks the political deadlock, look like for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Because, sorry, I know you mentioned that the international community needs to put more pressure on Israel and their occupation for ceasefire. Do you believe that this is realistic and feasible?
Yes, I do believe it's realistic, and I do believe it's doable. There can be no justification for Israel's occupation either of Gaza or of the West Bank. And if you think about it, if we were now in the West Bank, any of you coming into school this morning would have been through 5 or 6 checkpoints to get here. And half of you probably wouldn't have got here at all because you'd never got past those checkpoints. And so that is the daily life of school students and any other students on the West Bank. And now we have the settlers increasing a number of settlements, destroying Palestinian villages, and the wall that was built to protect the engagement by Israel within the West Bank has obviously taken away a lot of land and water supplies for people. Gaza, I've been to many times. I've been to the West Bank many times. I've been to Israel many times. Is now almost totally destroyed. This morning I was talking to somebody who had lived in Gaza, and I asked him how the Beach Primary School was in Jalalabia refugee camp. It's one I've been to a couple of times. And he said, sadly, Jeremy, it's gone. There's only rubble on the ground where that school was. It was a beautiful, thriving primary school. How can you justify bombing a primary school? Bombing a primary school with children in it. That's what happened. And so, yes, the occupation has to end. Israel is only able to do all of this because the weapons it's supplied by Britain, partly, but mainly by the USA. And the demand we've been making of the British government is that we cease the supply of weapons to Israel, and crucially, the parts of the F-35 jet, which is the main plane Israel uses to bomb. 15% of its components are made in Britain. So we've demanded that there be no direct exports of those parts to Israel. That has now been achieved. The government has stopped direct exports of those parts to Israel. But here's the thing. They're still selling parts to the plane on a global supply chain, which I suspect ends up in Israel anyway. And so that's the demand I make, to cease the arms supplies to Israel, therefore to bring about a ceasefire. A ceasefire will obviously stop the slaughter of Gaza and the West Bank, will bring those surviving hostages back home, and will give some hope to the whole region. But the destruction has been appalling. 2 million people on the West Bank, in Gaza, 60,000 known dead already, and that number's likely to rise. It is something horrible. In the most horrible thing I've seen in my lifetime is watching people being killed on live television like it's a reality show. The war has got to stop. the arms supply will help to bring about the end of that war, and will give more support to those brave minority of people in Israel that do stand up against their government and do hate seeing Palestinian lives being destroyed. So let's never allow the denigration of a people because of what they are. That's how the slave trade was sustained. That's how the racist acts of the USA were sustained. That's how the occupation of other countries is sustained, by always demeaning the victim and the occupied. So let's please do everything we can to bring about peace for the Palestinian people.